Imagine waking up one day to find that every comfort you once leaned on, every distraction, every safety net, every illusion of stability has been stripped away. No phone glowing with meaningless notifications, no television murmuring empty promises, no job title to hold you upright, no applause to validate your existence. Just you standing alone with the raw weight of your life pressing on your shoulders. What would you see in the silence? Would you find strength, or would you collapse under the unbearable gravity of your own unmasked reality? It is a terrifying thought, because beneath the noise, beneath the daily rituals that dull the sharp edge of being, there lies something we spend our lives avoiding: suffering. Everywhere you turn, the world whispers the same command: escape it, buy your way out of it. Distract yourself from it. Pretend it doesn't exist. But what if everything we believe about suffering is not only wrong but inverted? What if suffering isn't a curse, but the very crucible in which our greatest power is forged? This is the contradiction that Friedrich Nietzsche hurled like a thunderbolt into the heart of modern humanity. Suffering is not merely something to endure. It is something to embrace, something to transmute, something to weaponize. But ask yourself, do you believe that? Or do you instinctively recoil, as most people do? Because deep down, our instincts tell us that suffering is poison. We label it as weakness, as failure, as proof that life is unjust. And yet, paradoxically, when you look at history, when you look at every titan of human spirit, from philosophers to warriors, from artists to revolutionaries, suffering is always there. It stands not as their downfall, but as the fire in which they became unbreakable. Why is it that those who have endured the greatest pain often radiate the most profound wisdom, the most ferocious strength, the most unshakable courage? And why, at the same time, do those who live only in comfort so often become fragile, hollow, restless? Could it be that suffering itself is not the problem, but rather the way we perceive it? Think about your own life. Every heartbreak that shattered you, every failure that humiliated you, every loss that left you hollow, they carved into you a depth you did not possess before. Without those experiences, you might still be the person you once were: naive, shallow, fragile, unable to grasp the depths of existence. So the haunting question arises: what if your suffering is not your enemy, but your greatest untapped ally? Nietzsche's voice cuts through time with unsettling clarity. One must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star. Chaos, not comfort. Turmoil, not tranquility. Pain, not pleasure. This is not what we want to hear, and yet it resonates in a way that comfort never could. But if this is true, why do we resist it so violently? Why do we drown ourselves in distractions? Why do we worship at the altar of convenience? Why do we anesthetize our lives to avoid the sting of reality? Perhaps because to accept suffering as essential is to admit that life itself is not designed for happiness, at least not in the way we have been taught. It is to admit that pain is not an accident to be eradicated, but a fundamental feature of existence. And in that admission lies a horrifying responsibility. If suffering cannot be avoided, then the question is no longer how do we escape it, but what do we do with it? Do we let it break us? Do we let it harden us into bitterness, resentment, self-destruction? Or do we seize it, wrestle with it, and turn it into a force so potent that it transforms us into something greater than we ever imagined possible? This is the great question that stands at the center of Nietzsche's philosophy. The question that splits existence open and demands an answer from you personally. When suffering comes and it will you run from it like the world tells you to? Or will you face it, embrace it, and alchemize it into power? Because hidden inside your darkest pain may be the very key to your liberation. And that key is what we must now uncover. The hidden problem and psychological, philosophical roots. Why do we fear suffering so much? Why do we recoil from it as if it were an aberration, an error in the code of existence that should not be there? The answer lies not only in our individual psychology, but also in the architecture of the world we inhabit. To understand why Nietzsche's insight feels so radical, we must first expose the hidden problem, the way our culture, our minds, and even our deepest instincts conspire to turn us against the very thing that could save us. Start from childhood. We are programmed to seek pleasure and avoid pain. This conditioning runs deeper than societal rules. It is written into our biology. Our nervous system fires in alarm when discomfort arises. We seek soothing, distraction, anything that will numb the rawness of reality. And society, with its endless machinery of consumption, is only too eager to provide those narcotics: food, entertainment, technology, shallow validation. Everything becomes a way to plaster over the wound of existence. But here lies the paradox. The very avoidance of suffering makes us weaker, more fragile, more enslaved to forces outside ourselves. Like muscles that atrophy without strain, the soul itself decays when it is shielded from hardship. Carl Jung once warned that neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. In other words, when we refuse to confront pain directly, it doesn't vanish, it metastasizes into anxiety, emptiness, resentment, and compulsions that quietly corrode us from within. And still, we run. The French existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre spoke of bad faith, the human tendency to flee from freedom by pretending we are mere victims of circumstance. We tell ourselves stories. This suffering is meaningless. This pain is unfair. I can't handle this. Yet beneath those stories lurks the terrifying truth Nietzsche insisted upon. Suffering is unavoidable. The only real choice is whether we will face it consciously or drown beneath it. But why does our culture, in particular, resist this so fiercely? The answer lies in modernity's obsession with comfort. Aldous Huxley, in Brave New World, envisioned a society drugged into bliss, stripped of struggle, sterilized of pain and, in turn, sterilized of meaning. Is that not eerily close to the world we now inhabit? Instant gratification sits in every pocket. At the first sign of discomfort, we swipe, scroll, consume. We have been taught not to endure reality, but to flee it. Yet Schopenhauer, the philosopher of pessimism, argued that suffering is woven into the very fabric of existence. For him, life is a constant striving, an endless hunger that can never be fully satisfied. To live is to suffer, that was his bleak conclusion. Nietzsche, once a disciple of Schopenhauer, saw the same truth but refused to stop there. If suffering is inevitable, then why not embrace it, even exalt it, as the force that compels growth, transformation, and greatness? Still, psychology resists. Our minds are wired with cognitive biases that trick us into believing suffering is abnormal. The hedonic treadmill ensures that even after triumphs, we quickly return to baseline, restless for more. The negativity bias makes pain feel sharper, more intolerable than any joy. Together, these biases whisper the same poisonous lie: suffering should not exist. And yet it does, always. This is the hidden problem. Humanity has declared war on suffering without realizing that in doing so, it has declared war on life itself. Nietzsche described the modern individual as a creature of resentimenta, festering resentment born from denying life's brutality instead of confronting it. He saw how this resentment warped values, creating a morality of weakness that glorified meekness, passivity, and victimhood, while condemning strength, ambition, and will. It was not kindness that drove this morality, he warned, but fear, the fear of suffering and the refusal to face it head-on. Think of how this shows up today. The endless race for comfort disguises itself as progress. We build technologies to eliminate inconvenience. We glorify lifestyles of ease as success. Yet beneath this sheen of comfort, anxiety festers, depression climbs. People who have everything feel hollow. Why? Because without suffering, without struggle, the soul cannot feel its own weight. A life devoid of hardship is not paradise, is paralysis. Consider Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist who survived Nazi concentration camps. He witnessed firsthand the unbearable extremities of human suffering, and yet, from the heart of that abyss, he declared that life is never devoid of meaning. Even in suffering, especially in suffering. For Frankl, meaning arises not in spite of pain, but because of it. He saw that those who endured were not those who fled from their suffering, but those who found within it a reason to bear it. The hidden problem, then, is not suffering itself. The problem is that we have been trained to see suffering as senseless, intolerable, and shameful, when in reality it is the forge of transformation. Nietzsche's challenge is not just intellectual, but deeply personal. Can you reframe the pain that wounds you as the very material from which your strength is born? Can you resist the temptation to numb, distract, and flee, and instead stand naked before the storm of existence and say, "Yes, this is mine to endure, and from this I will rise"? Because until you can, you will remain enslaved not to suffering itself, but to your avoidance of it. And the longer you avoid, the deeper the chains sink into your soul. This is why Nietzsche called for the birth of a new kind of human, one who does not see suffering as a curse, but as a challenge, one who dares not to escape pain, but to transmute it into greatness. But before we can imagine such a transformation, we must see clearly the consequences of our denial. Because every time we flee from suffering, every time we numb it, bury it, deny it, something darker begins to grow. Something that quietly shapes our lives while we remain blind to it. And that shadow is what we must now confront. The unseen consequences. You can deny suffering, but you cannot escape its shadow. When you refuse to face it, it does not disappear, it mutates. It seeps into your thoughts, your habits, your relationships, and even the values of entire cultures. This is the silent, unseen consequence of avoidance. Suffering doesn't vanish, it multiplies. Think of a wound that festers when left untreated. You may cover it, hide it from view, convince yourself it isn't there, but beneath the bandage, infection spreads. So too with the human soul. Every unacknowledged sorrow, every repressed frustration, every buried trauma remains alive within you, reshaping your identity from the inside out. Nietzsche warned of this infection in the form of that poisonous state where those who cannot transform their suffering twist it into blame, envy, and quiet hostility. Instead of rising, they sink, and in their sinking, they demand that others sink too. Suffering untransformed becomes bitterness, and bitterness, left unchecked, reshapes entire societies. Look around. How much of the modern world is built not on strength, but on avoidance? We medicate emptiness with entertainment, scrolling endlessly through curated lives that make us feel even more hollow. We seek validation in fleeting likes because the silence of being alone with our own pain is unbearable. We chase consumerism, new clothes, new gadgets, new pleasures, not because they bring lasting joy, but because they distract us from the yawning void inside. And yet, despite these endless distractions, the void only grows. Anxiety disorders skyrocket. Depression quietly spreads like wildfire. Addiction, whether to substances, screens, or dopamine-fueled pleasures, chains people in invisible prisons. The modern individual appears more free than ever, yet is bound by compulsions far stronger than iron. Why? Because every attempt to run from suffering deepens its grip. The brain itself testifies to this. Neurologically, the more we escape discomfort with quick fixes, scrolling, sugar, substances, the more our reward pathways adapt. Pleasure loses intensity. Boredom grows sharper. Suffering, rather than being lessened, becomes amplified until the smallest adversity feels unbearable. We have engineered a culture of fragility, souls so shielded from hardship that the very experience of living becomes intolerable. And this fragility doesn't stay private, it spills into the public sphere. Whole societies begin to bend their values around the avoidance of pain. Discomfort becomes taboo. Words are treated as violence. Struggle is seen not as a rite of passage, but as an injustice. Nietzsche would look at our world and see not progress, but decay, a collective refusal to grow teeth, a demand that life itself becomes soft and harmless. But life will never bend to that demand. This is the brutal truth. Life does not care about your desire for comfort. Suffering will find you. If you spend your years running, it will catch you in the form of regret, emptiness, and a soul that never discovered its strength. And that, perhaps, is the greatest unseen consequence of all the silent tragedy of unlived potential. How many lives end not with a scream, but with a sigh, not with catastrophe, but with quiet disappointment. People reach their final days and realize they have avoided the very challenges that would have shaped them into something greater. They chose the comfort of safety over the fire of transformation, and in doing so, they never truly lived. Nietzsche feared this more than death itself, the creation of what he called the last man. The last man is not a tyrant or a conqueror, but a creature of comfort. Timid, shallow, content to live without risk, without greatness, without depth. He avoids suffering at all costs, and therefore he avoids the very possibility of becoming anything more than mediocre. The last man blinks, yawns, and declares, "We have invented happiness," but his happiness is nothing more than numbness, a dull glow of sedation that hides the absence of meaning. And here is the paradox. The more we flee suffering, the more meaningless life becomes, because meaning is not found in ease. It is not born in moments of indulgence or escape. Meaning emerges when we confront the abyss, when we suffer for something greater than ourselves, when we endure willingly rather than flee cowardly. This is why Nietzsche's question burns like fire across time. What is the cost of your avoidance? Not just the cost to you, but to the world that might have been changed by your courage. Every time you turn away from suffering, you turn away from a path that could have led to transformation, not only for yourself, but for others, because strength is contagious. When one person dares to face suffering, to endure, to rise, they light a fire in others. And weakness is equally contagious. When one person numbs themselves, shrinks back, chooses comfort over growth, they teach others to do the same. And slowly, silently, an entire culture loses its will to strive. This is the unseen consequence. Suffering avoided becomes suffering multiplied. It spreads through individuals, relationships, societies, and generations. It corrodes meaning, hollows out courage, and leaves us adrift in a world that feels increasingly unbearable, precisely because we have refused to bear it. So the question becomes urgent. If running from suffering leads only to weakness, bitterness, and meaninglessness, what alternative remains? Nietzsche would say, rebellion, a refusal to conform to the cultural worship of comfort, a radical embrace of suffering as the raw material of strength. A transformation so counterintuitive that it feels almost insane. But insanity may be exactly what is required to break free. And it is here that we must turn toward rebellion, toward the fire, toward the possibility of turning suffering itself into power. The rebellion, how to break free. What if the very thing you have feared your whole life is not your enemy, but your greatest ally? What if suffering is not a curse to escape, but a resource raw, unrefined, terrifyingly powerful that you can shape into greatness? This is the rebellion Nietzsche called for. The refusal to submit to the world's obsession with comfort. The decision to embrace suffering, not with resignation, but with fierce defiance. To say, if life demands that I suffer, then I will suffer on my own terms, and I will turn it into strength. Breaking free begins with a shift of perception. The first act of rebellion is not against society, but against your own instincts. Every nerve in your body will scream at you to run from pain. Your biology will urge you to numb it. The culture around you will hand you infinite distractions. To rebel is to look pain in the eye and say, no, I will not flee. I will endure. I will transform. This act alone is revolutionary, because in that moment, suffering ceases to be a predator chasing you. It becomes raw material in your hands. Nietzsche understood this with brutal clarity. The individual who dares to embrace suffering becomes untouchable, because nothing life throws at them can break them. Every hardship only feeds their power. But how does this transformation happen? It begins by reinterpreting suffering. You cannot erase it, but you can assign it meaning. Viktor Frankl discovered this in the darkest of places, surrounded by death and despair. He realized that those who survived were not always the strongest physically, but those who could give meaning to their suffering. A loved one waiting for them, a cause greater than themselves. Even the determination to endure with dignity, these meanings transformed unbearable suffering into a form of power. The rebellion, then, is not merely enduring suffering, but choosing how to endure it. Instead of asking, why me? You ask, what can this become? Instead of shrinking under the weight, you hammer it into shape. The blow that could shatter you becomes the hammer that forges you. Consider the great creators, warriors, and thinkers of history. Dostoevsky, exiled to a Siberian prison camp, transformed his torment into literature that still pierces souls. Nelson Mandela, imprisoned for 27 years, emerged not broken but strengthened, his suffering becoming the foundation for reconciliation rather than revenge. Nietzsche himself, plagued by illness and isolation, transmuted his pain into words that shook the world. What unites them is not the absence of suffering, but the audacity to confront it directly and turn it into power. This is not easy. It demands what Nietzsche called amor fati, the love of fate, not merely tolerating what happens to you, but embracing it as necessary, even beautiful. Imagine looking back on every hardship in your life and saying, yes, that was mine. I would not erase it, because it made me what I am. This is the ultimate rebellion, to love your suffering, not because it is pleasant, but because it is yours, because it is the soil from which your strength grows. But rebellion is not only philosophical, it must be lived. It requires daily practices that embody this perspective. To choose challenges deliberately instead of waiting for life to impose them. To embrace discomfort rather than seek constant ease. This is why Nietzsche admired the warrior spirit, not the brutality of war itself, but the willingness to face danger, struggle, and hardship as a path to transcendence. In modern life, this rebellion can take many forms. It may mean resisting the lure of constant distraction and sitting with silence, even when it feels unbearable. It may mean confronting fears you have avoided for years, daring to step into uncertainty rather than clinging to safety. It may mean choosing the harder path, one that demands sacrifice, patience, and resilience, because you know that only in the furnace of difficulty can your true self be revealed. This rebellion is not about masochism. It is not about seeking pain for its own sake. It is about refusing to let suffering go to waste. If you must suffer, and you must, then let every ounce of it be used to forge strength, depth, and meaning. And here lies the strange paradox. Once you embrace suffering, its power over you diminishes. Fear feeds on avoidance. But when you look suffering in the eye and declare that you will not run, you become larger than it. You stand above it. The chains that once bound you fall away, and you realize the truth. Suffering does not diminish you. Your avoidance does. Nietzsche envisioned a new kind of human arising from this rebellion, the Übermensch, or overman. Not a tyrant, not a god, but an individual who has transcended the values of weakness, who has embraced suffering and transformed it into creative power. The Übermensch does not curse existence, but affirms it fully, even its darkest storms. To walk this path is to reject the destiny of the last man, that fragile soul who avoids suffering and therefore avoids life. To rebel is to claim a different fate, to burn brightly, to carry scars as symbols of strength, to live so fully that even suffering becomes an expression of your power. But this raises a final, terrifying question. If suffering can indeed be turned into strength, what is the ultimate truth hidden within it? What is the final revelation waiting for those who dare not only to endure, but to embrace everything life hurls at them? That truth, Nietzsche's most dangerous, most liberating insights, what we must now confront, the ultimate truth, the final, most powerful realization. What if suffering is not an obstacle on the path of life, but life itself? What if the very thing you have been taught to curse, to numb, to fear, is the key not only to strength, but to the deepest affirmation of existence? This is the final, most dangerous truth Nietzsche left for us. It is not a truth for the faint of heart. It is not a comforting philosophy to soothe your wounds. It is a truth that demands everything from you, that dares you to live without excuse, without escape, without refuge. Nietzsche called it the doctrine of eternal recurrence. Imagine this: every moment of your life, every joy, every heartbreak, every humiliation, every triumph, every second of suffering must be lived again, not once, not twice, but an infinite number of times, over and over, in an endless cycle. You will relive this exact life. Now ask yourself, would this thought crush you or liberate you? Most people recoil in horror. To endure suffering once is hard enough. Who would choose to relive it eternally? But here lies Nietzsche's challenge. If you can learn to affirm life so deeply, If you can embrace suffering so fully that you would choose to relive it forever, then you have transcended fear. Then you are free. This is the culmination of everything. Suffering is not to be tolerated reluctantly, but to be embraced so fiercely that you would welcome its return eternally. This is not mere endurance, it is amor fati carried to its absolute limit. The love of fate so radical that you say yes to all of existence, even its darkest nights, even its deepest wounds. Think about what this means. If you curse your suffering, eternal recurrence is a nightmare. But if you embrace it, eternal recurrence becomes the ultimate affirmation. You are no longer a victim of pain, but its master. You are no longer diminished by suffering, but exalted by it. Here, Nietzsche's philosophy reaches its peak. Suffering is not an error in the system. It is not a punishment or a problem to be solved. It is the very texture of life, the very force that sharpens meaning, deepens joy, and forges greatness. Without suffering, there is no depth, no growth, no ecstasy. Without the abyss, there is no height. Carl Jung understood this as well. He wrote, "No tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell." The higher the peak of human possibility, the deeper the suffering that must be endured. To flee suffering is to remain shallow. To embrace it is to plunge roots into the depths of existence itself, and thereby rise toward the heavens. And here is the paradox. Once you fully embrace suffering, once you affirm it, it ceases to crush you. It becomes fuel. You are no longer broken by it. You are broken open. Your scars cease to be shameful. They become symbols of initiation. Proof that you have walked through fire and emerged transformed. The ultimate truth, then, is terrifying in its simplicity. Suffering is not your enemy. It is your teacher, your raw material, your proving ground. It is the weight that, if carried willingly, reveals your strength. But Nietzsche goes further. It is not enough to endure suffering. It must be affirmed. To live fully, to rise beyond resentment, you must look at life in its totality: pain, loss, tragedy included, and declare, yes, again, forever. This is the threshold between the last man and the overman. The last man curses life because of its suffering. The overman blesses life because of its suffering. The last man numbs, hides, and shrinks. The overman endures, transforms, and creates. And so the question returns to you not as abstract philosophy, but as a living fire. If your life were to repeat eternally, exactly as it is, would you embrace it? Would you say yes to every wound, every grief, every night you thought you could not survive? Or would you collapse under the weight of eternal recurrence, crying out that life is unbearable? This is not merely a thought experiment. It is a mirror. How you respond reveals the degree to which you have embraced or fled from your suffering. If the idea terrifies you, it means you are still at war with life. If it excites you, even terrifies you in a thrilling way, it means you are approaching Nietzsche's ultimate rebellion, the complete affirmation of existence. And this is the truth Nietzsche leaves us with. The way to freedom is not escape. It is affirmation. The way to strength is not avoidance. It is transformation. The way to meaning is not in eliminating suffering, but in embracing it so fully that even if life itself were to loop eternally, you would not curse it, you would bless it. Now the question is no longer theoretical. It is not about Nietzsche or Jung or Frankl. It is about you. Your suffering, your life. Will you keep fleeing, numbing, hiding only to grow weaker, more fragile? more resentful? Or will you rebel, embrace the fire, affirm the pain, and use it to forge yourself into something greater than you ever imagined? Will you collapse as the last man or rise as the overman? The choice is yours. And whether you realize it or not, you are already making it every day in how you face your suffering. So ask yourself now, and answer with brutal honesty: if this life, with all its pain, were to repeat eternally, would you run from it, or would you say yes?